magnets, how do they work? Fucking magnets, how do they work? Fucking magnets, how do they work?
Hey friends, welcome back to Zach and Brian Watch the Watchmen. I'm Brian, with me is Zach. We're talking about the second episode of Watchmen today. The episode is titled Martial Feats of Comanche Horsemanship. That's a tough thing to say a lot of times. Which is the name of the painting that we see in Judd's house after a discovery is made. But before we start, just want to say again, this is a spoiler podcast. If you have not watched the episode, please turn around, watch the episode, and then come back and listen to us talk about it. So before we get into sort of the minutia here, Zach, after the first episode, you had said that you weren't sure if the show was good, but you knew it wasn't bad. How are you feeling about the show now that you've seen 2 episodes?
Now I almost feel pretty comfortable in saying that I think it's good.
You also like it, right? There's a difference between it being good and you liking it.
I very much like it, and I am more comfortable thinking it's good. In fact, we'll get to it later. I only have like one minor nitpick with this episode, but it comes a little bit later.
Okay, sure, yeah. So the episode begins with a weird flashback that at first seems a little bit out of place in the episode, but we see a German woman during World War I being drafted into typing up a sort of like a piece of propaganda that will fall from the sky for American soldiers, specifically African American soldiers. Basically saying, why are you fighting for America? They're terrible to you. Things are better in Germany. And we see that this is caught by the man who we will soon know as Will, his father, while in World War II. And then we see Will himself pick it up.
World War One.
Sorry, World War One. World War One. Yes.
I had said that. Yeah, you said it right first.
Yeah, exactly. And then we see Will with this as a child a couple of scenes later. What did you think of this cold open for the show?
So I thought it was really powerful and chilling, and I'm meant to check and see if this was based in real events, if Germany actually used this tactic in World War One, and it kind of slipped my mind. Did you happen to?
No,
to check
I meant to do the same thing.
Yeah, but I mean, really interesting and unsettling, but also just kind of like one of those makes you think moments, and not in like a way that is particularly comfortable.
No,
you know?
No, not at all. This show does a lot of that, actually.
Yeah.
For a show that is ostensibly about the book Watchmen that had very little to do with race in it, this show is so much about race, and spoiler alert for future episodes, that does not go away. So anyway, we now get a couple of scenes of Angela and Will, as we find out this older gentleman's name is, in the Milk and Hanoi bakery. She asks him repeatedly who he is, and he says, "I'm the man who strung up your chief of police." And then he claims to possibly be Dr. Manhattan.
So good.
It was wonderful. That is one of my favorite scenes thus far. You see how good both of these actors are. And it's very funny.
And his claims are absurd, but also like not outside the realm of possibility. You know, the argument that he makes is, again, you're kind of like, but is he telling the truth?
Yeah, exactly. But the biggest takeaway from this, aside from him saying that he has psychic powers, he might be Dr. Manhattan, that he's strung up the sheriff, the chief, I keep saying sheriff, the chief of police, and all that. The big takeaway here is that Angela takes the coffee mug he was drinking for purposes that we'll find out in a little while. We also get here the flashback to the White Knight, to Angela's experience on the White Knight, of herself being shot and her and Cal nearly being killed by 7K members. And I thought that sequence was pretty chilling. And
yeah, to say the least.
Yeah. Go for it. Talk about it.
I was gonna say I was really surprised that they show us that scene so early in the show. You know, had a brief reference to it in the first episode, and it kind of seemed like something that they would string out, maybe refer to it, ominously, and we would maybe see glimpses of it, or maybe not, like if anything towards the end of the season, but to show it this early and to kind of frame it in a way that highlights Angela and Judd's relationship, and then juxtaposing that with um, the police finding the body, and Angela kind of like saying goodbye. Um, I thought it was a nice touch.
Yeah, the show does a really good job of doling out information, and that was one of the things that I felt like people would get mad at with Lost, let's say, where there'd be so many new questions asked, but there was never any information given. And I feel
Mm.
like this show does a nicer job of balancing that, where every episode there is a lot more information that is given, but there's also a ton of new questions asked.
Right, right. I have a question for you about the White Knight as it's presented,
Sure,
and
yeah.
kind of your take. There is a uh I have like a degree of I guess kind of bewilderment maybe at the circumstances here, and I wonder if this is something that will be addressed at some point in the show, and it may be something that you have some insight on that you can't talk about. Um, but I do find it odd that the Seventh Cavalry, the ostensibly white supremacist Ku Klux Klan stand-in, would go after the police officers.
Well,
Eh,
first, that has not been established. There has not been a lot of talk about that later in the series thus far.
Okay,
So
okay,
I can speculate wildly with you. Do you want to hear my reasoning for it?
sure, go for it.
So in this episode, we get a scene. It's a very small scene of a young girl buying a bunch of newspapers, and it continues the Watchmen tradition of uh, of the newsstand being an important place, right?
Hmm.
And we hear this the worker there basically talking about how Redford is, and his like I forget what he calls them. It's basically like a version like the liberal Nazis or something like that are taking away our rights. And I think that there's this idea of that Redford and the liberal society is taking away the rights of the average folks.
Hmm.
Um, and so I could see there being maybe just sort of a what's what I'm looking for, like a connection between there, where it's just that these people are working for the bad guys.
Right, sure, sure. And I think that's a good read on it. I think the part that I find just a little bit not even like perplexing, but just a little odd is that, I talked about in the first episode, this show very much feels like a read on the current climate, except in this one part where um I feel like the place that police falls is typically not on the side of victimhood.
Sure.
Traditionally,
Yes.
that's not
Yes.
always the case. That's definitely not always the case, and I don't want to speak just like broadly.
Yeah.
Um,
Just our listeners already know this, but you don't know this yet. I just sent you the uncolored version of our podcast art in the Skype
oh,
chat.
nice.
So,
Okay.
listeners, you have seen the wonderful Joe Hunter art for our podcast already. Zach's about to see the uncolored version for the first time, and it's amazing.
Oh, this is, yeah, very good, very good. Um,
Anyway, sorry. But yeah, it's definitely going. I feel like the relationship between the police and the population is incredibly different than what we're used to.
sure, sure. Which is fine. Like I don't necessarily want this. I want this show to touch on these topics, but I don't want it to necessarily just kind of beat a dead Comanche horse and not do anything like, I guess I wanted not play it too safe, but also like say something important. So I just thought that that was an interesting kind of distinction between, I guess, kind of current public sentiment and the way things kind of are in 2019 versus how things are in this future Watchmen universe.
Right. Right. Yeah. No. It's definitely a point well taken, and something that I think is probably the biggest difference, aside from one other thing, which I guess now we can talk about it. I was going to save it for a little bit later, but since we're bringing it up, have you noticed that no one has a cell phone and there's been no mention of the internet?
No, I actually haven't.
Everyone has
But
a
that's a
pager.
really interesting observation. Yeah, I have noticed the pagers. I kind of thought that that was maybe just, clandestine police
Right.
communication.
Right. No, but no
Um,
one has a smartphone. No one has a cell
right.
phone, and we've seen no one on a computer yet.
That is a really interesting point. I hadn't really thought about that.
And I
Um,
wonder if that is like what. So as we're watching this, we're obviously coming up with theories and all of that. As we're talking. But one of the things that I thought of was, maybe this is because the maybe this is because when Doctor Manhattan was around, there were so many sort of technological advances that came so quickly that people stopped trying to advance stuff because it was just there was this sort of preordained advancement there. You didn't
mhm.
need to work as hard to come up with new things because Dr. Manhattan was doing it all the time. And so maybe there was a lack of sort of, advancement and focus on science and creation because of that.
Yeah, lack of innovation
Yeah,
maybe.
that's a perfect way to put
But
it. Yes.
but there are some ways where technology is clearly kind of ahead of where we are in some things.
Right. Like we
We
see
see.
Topher building that thing.
Yeah, that thing. That's so cool. But yeah, I think that's a good point. And the thing, this idea that maybe the internet and cell phones and things aren't as they are now, coupled with the masks, the emphasis on masks with the police force, reminds me of the Private Eye, the Brian K.
Yes.
Vaughan,
Yes.
Marcos Martin comic.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if maybe Lindelof is drawing some inspiration there.
From his
Um,
former staff writer Brian K. Vaughan.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So I don't know that, but you mentioning that, it brought that to mind.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's see what else we got here. One of the things I found really interesting about this episode is we have clearly established Angela as our protagonist for this series, right? But we also see how easily and coldly she lies all the time. Like she is not afraid to just straight up tell someone something that's not true. Whether it's her
Yes.
fellow police officers or the only person she seems truly honest with is Cal, her husband. And I meant to mention this last time we talked about this. I love their relationship. I love how she is clearly the boss in the relationship, and he does not seem resentful of that at all. That he just accepts that like she's badass, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah, their dynamic is really fun and refreshing. It's kind of the bright spot in this show right now, I think.
Yes.
Um, but also their entire family dynamic in general, which I figure eventually we'll probably get to a little bit more of that. The revelation of
Well,
who
we can talk about
their
that right
kids
now, I
are.
guess.
You want to? Okay,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I guess that's coming out of the White Knight stuff. We find out that um, their
Her
three
partner.
kids,
Yeah.
Topher, and I don't know if we have the names of the other two. We
We,
probably
we
do.
we've heard them, but I don't remember them. Topher's the one
Yeah,
that stands out.
sure, sure. So they were the children of Angela's uh, police partner,
Hmm.
and who, both him and his wife were killed in the White Knight, and so they took custody of the children, who were still fairly young at the time. Topher old enough at least to hide himself and his sisters. And so you get the impression that Topher still remembers their parents, but maybe the younger sisters don't. And you
Right.
see the difference in how they interact with their adopted parents in this episode.
And there was a really subtle thing that I noticed on my second or third rewatch of this, because I've seen these now. I watched them once myself for the press junket. I've watched two of them with Borat voice my wife, and now I'm watching them again to write about them and podcast about them. But I noticed that the mug that Angela gives Will is a World's Greatest Mother mug, and that's just an interesting commentary on her motherhood situation. Like that probably doesn't come from Topher, because she probably is very clear to, I mean, she mentions Topher's parents to Topher in a scene they share together, so that seems like, maybe like you said, the girls don't remember their parents too much, and so they have no problem calling her mom.
Right,
But,
exactly. Yeah, agreed. And I thought that scene with Angela and Topher was so good. I think the actor who plays Topher is really talented for
yes,
a younger actor. Um, and just kind of the pathos and nuance in that scene I thought was really well handled.
he does a couple of things that are really great in that scene. First of all, you see he is clearly taken aback, and then he begins to rationalize it. He says, well, he was a police officer, he knew the risks, and then he said, he's not my real uncle, and then he smashes the thing he's building.
Hmm.
And then he asks if he can go watch TV. Like
Yes.
there's such a
Yes.
wonderful progression of seeing a young mind deal with all of this.
Yes. And he goes to watch something in particular on the television.
Yes, he does. American Hero
Maybe
Story.
not immediately, but later on in the episode.
Yeah.
Um,
I love how pulpy and cheesy American Hero Story is.
so this was the thing that I alluded to.
Your one nitpick?
I my one nitpick, and I think it might be intentional, so it might not even be fair to call it a nitpick, because of how cheesy it is. But I thought that the person narrating the TV show, kind of the stand-in for Hooded Justice, was just so over the top, so like Rorschach-esque.
Well, let me tell you, American Hero Story pops up again later in the show,
I figured it probably is a recurring thing,
and it's just as cheesy. So I do
yeah.
think that's intentional.
Okay. I thought that and especially just like the dialogue itself, there's that one line that is in one of the trailers of, like, who am I? Well, if I wasn't wearing a mask, I could tell you, or something like,
Yeah.
something lame like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was just tonally very weird, and I think that's intentional, but it wasn't my favorite part of the episode by a long shot.
There are two things about that show that I want to talk about,
Okay.
which is, I want to talk about, have you seen Once Upon a Time in Hollywood?
No, I still haven't seen it yet.
Okay, there is something that the Hooded Justice does that is extraordinarily reminiscent of a scene in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but obviously they couldn't have known that when making the show, right? It's
Sure.
funny how there are two, like, when you see Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, you'd be like, oh, that's what Brian was talking about. So you'll definitely see it. The other thing is that I like that it shows everybody watching this show. Like, the Seventh K is watching it, they're watching it. It seems like this is like a cultural phenomenon. And I think that sort of tracks with how people would treat vigilantes and superheroes if that was a thing, especially if that was a thing in the past. Like, this is essentially Gunsmoke of its era, right?
Yeah. I thought it was interesting too. There are a number of moments in the first two episodes of Watchmen where there are things that happen, and I think, oh gee, why don't we actually have these things? Like, I think the thing in the first episode was the locks on the police officers' guns in their cars, and then
Right.
in this episode it was the, like, very thorough and extreme overview of the content in the episode.
Yes.
Um, and on one hand, I think that was a little tongue in cheek, maybe, but also, it did kind of tie into kind of the zeitgeist and the sentiment of kind of, content warnings, and, like, making people aware of and being sensitive to um triggering concepts and things. So I thought that was interesting.
And that seems like the type of thing that if that happened today, there'd be a lot of people who would be pretty dismissive of that. And I think that in this world, this is the stuff that the people criticize Redford for.
Right.
Like, so I think that's, again, a nice sort of, a nice way of bridging our world and their world. So there are a couple other small things I want to get to before the two big things at the end of the episode. The first thing is we also see, we find out about Topher and his siblings and how they came to be in Angela and Cal's custody. But we also see, is it their uncle, you think, who comes by to try and see the kids? I think he's probably too old to be a grandfather. I mean, too young to be a grandfather, right?
That's a good call. I think I had maybe initially thought grandfather, but uncle might be a better call. But yeah, regardless, a relative, we can
Yes.
say.
Some sort of relative comes, and clearly Cal and Angela don't want him involved with the family. And I wonder if there are a lot of reasons why that could be, right? They're trying to get the kids into like a new world, or a new life rather, and not remind them of all the old stuff as much, which I would understand. Or, I think that this show has set up that like white people are suspect. and
Sure, yeah.
and
And I think he fits a stereotype, for better or worse, that
yes.
could like raise suspicions of, okay, what are your affiliations with
Yes.
7K,
exactly. Yeah.
And I think that, that's clearly intentional. I think that could be a misdirect. But I think you're meant to have those suspicions.
Yes, agreed. And then the last thing I want to talk about before getting to sort of the two big meaty parts of the episode is I find it really interesting the plain nature in which people speak about Dr. Manhattan. Like,
yes.
At one point when Angela is explaining to Cal what happened with Will, she says like, and he said he's Dr. Manhattan, and Cal's like, but Dr. Manhattan's on the moon. On Mars, and she's like, that's what I said. Like just how there's a very clear just like line of just like it. I don't know how else to describe it. It's just very funny to me. Not funny. It's very interesting to me just how all of the mystery has been taken away from Dr. Manhattan.
Yeah, when the fantastic becomes the mundane. Yeah, exactly. I agree.
All right, so there are two things I want to talk about, and I think they're the two things you're going to want to talk about too. But let's start, well, speaking of Dr. Manhattan, with the scene with Adrian Veidt in his castle.
Oh man, maybe so. Like, I did not expect this, but the Veidt parts of these episodes are becoming like the showstoppers. The scene stealers.
Yes.
Which I guess is like no surprise. Jeremy Irons is a very well-respected actor, but I just love how weird and surreal these scenes are, especially this one.
Yeah. So this scene begins with him like riding up to his castle again, them singing for He's a Jolly Good Fellow again, same cake again, and then we see the first, presumably the first production of the Watchmaker's son.
Well, see, I wonder if it has not, because he tells Crookshanks to really to bring out the waterworks, to cry
Right.
more at this, which makes me think that this is not the first time it's happened.
Maybe it's not. And to be fair, the big reveal happens and no one seems surprised. So
right.
So maybe it's not the first. That's a good call. Yeah. So anyway, so we see this play that is horribly acted by these two people. And we see lots of people, like we see a violinist and people, they're all wearing these masks. That's sort of to, I guess, like, to not stand out as part of this play. And it's a very, very poorly written like version of the events that led John Osterman to become Dr. Manhattan. And he gets locked in the whatever chamber. And then Veidt pushes a fucking plunger and he bursts into flames. He just immolates him completely.
Yeah, he does, and Crookshanks does cry because why wouldn't you? Um,
But
and
then
but then
from the rafters comes a painted blue naked man, um,
not
wearing
not Tobias,
no, not just
not
no,
Tobias Funke.
no, wearing a like a fencing mask, essentially painted to look like Doctor Manhattan's mask,
Yes,
and you know, Vite is very pleased with this production. He's very happy with it,
yes.
and
The Watchmaker's son is a success.
yes, it is. And then everyone takes their masks off to reveal what, Zach?
They are all clones.
Yes, they are all clones. There is a female and a male, and they're all just clones of those people, and it's bonkers.
Yeah, definitely did not expect this. This is the show leaning into, again, I guess kind of like very much the fantastical and, the the technological aspect of this kind of post Dr. Manhattan world in a way that I really didn't expect it to. This is the easily the most comic booky part
Oh
of
yes,
the show so far.
yeah. Um, and then there's the way the scene ends is that basically Doctor Manhattan, Vite realizes that the burned up Mister Phillips uh, is still clutching the pocket watch, and you see Vite in this incredibly like I don't want to say inhumane, but just like with no concern, just breaks the fingers off of this burned corpse to take back his pocket watch.
Yeah, and he, insinuates that this is just the beginning, but I think maybe I'm misremembering. It might have been in the first episode, but doesn't he here say in this sequence something along the lines of, nothing ever ends? Or
Yes.
was that in the first
No, that's in
episode?
this one. That's in this one.
That
Yeah.
is, which, again, is kind of just a tongue in cheek reference to the fact that Watchmen is continuing despite all protestations.
Right. Yeah. I also just wanted to briefly mention, is that a tomato that he bites?
Yeah, tomato tree. What in the world?
Very strange.
Very
Um,
strange.
so that is certainly the most bonkers element of this episode. And spoiler alert, it continues to be a bonkers aspect of the show in general. You ain't seen nothing yet, folks.
I'm
I
very
I
excited.
hate to be that guy teasing stuff, but trust me, you're gonna it's just amazing. So, the last thing we got to talk about is that Angela finds out that Will is her grandfather.
Yeah, and the way that she does this is really interesting. She uses the DNA from the coffee cup and exploits a system set up for survivors and descendants of survivors of the
The Tulsa massacre.
Tulsa massacre. Which is, again, is another one of those things that I was like, oh, why doesn't this exist? Why doesn't,
Right.
Well, right. But yeah. So she exploits the system to find out that Will is her grandfather.
And he's 106 years old, we find out, which is also a thing like it's it's said in a way that is both matter of fact and she doesn't take it as crazily as I would take it if I met somebody so they were 106. So I'm
Hmm.
wondering if that's just Angela's just a steely character, or if in this world, because of Dr. Manhattan, perhaps people had just lived longer.
Yeah, I could definitely see that being the case. I mean, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So that's interesting. But then she basically decides that she's going to arrest him because he's just pissing her off. And so and this is also, we should talk about this. This is sort of, we see Angela as a police officer, but she's basically covering up this crime.
Yes,
You know,
yeah. There was a scene where she and Looking Glass were in the car, and he kind of moves the coffee cup out of the way and doesn't really ask about it, and she doesn't tell him. Um, and it's a really interesting scene. One, because he pulls his mask up in a very Rorschach-esque way as he's eating
yes.
his almonds or whatever they
Yes,
were.
and then we see him eat the same way watching American Hero Story later.
Yes, yes. Um, Again, highlighting those Rorschach ties.
Yeah. Um, we also see him be a dick to her when she says something about her children, and he says, "Your children," and we just see him just piss her off essentially. But yeah,
Yeah.
so she decides that she's gonna arrest him. She puts him into her car, and as she's putting the wheelchair into the trunk, some sort of flying machine comes by with a giant magnet like you'd see in a junkyard and just picks up her car.
He said he had friends in high places, and he was telling the truth.
Yes, he was.
So absurd. Like, the closest thing in like Lindelof's, kind of body of work that I thought of was the Trisha Tanaka is Dead episode of Lost, where the meteor comes down and
Yes.
kills this reporter, just kind of highlighting Hurley's bad luck
Yes.
following using the numbers, but just kind of the absurdity of this sequence reminded me of that immediately.
Well, this was the sequence that sort of really hooked me on the show. I mean, I liked the first two episodes up to this point. I did. I liked them more than I thought I would. They were interesting. But between the the Doctor Manhattan play, which happens, just 10 minutes or so before this, and then this sequence, it just kind of blows the doors off the world and shows you that things are not as straightforward as they appear, and how interesting it is to me that of how, I guess, just how much we don't know about the world anymore,
Right.
and that's really
Yeah.
fun.
It is fun, and somehow, despite like the very weighty, heavy subject matter, this show is still fun because of moments like this. Um, the stuff with Vite. Um, it is in a kind of much more enjoyable place, at least in terms of like my interests and sensibilities, and so um, it's just really interesting how. For listeners of the DC3 cast, we're kind of in the midst of two Watchmen sequels right now, this and Doomsday Clock. And while watching this episode, I kind of was wondering how this version of a Watchmen sequel would be received in comic book form. And I
Hmm.
think it's interesting that we're getting it as a television show.
Yes, agreed.
Um,
I also just realized we forgot a major thing to talk about here, which is
oh,
we
what's that?
forgot to talk about Judd's Ku Klux Klan robe that is hidden in his
Yes.
closet.
Yeah, skeletons in his
Yes.
closet.
I also love how literally Angela takes that. She actually says, like, "You said skeleton in the closet. I went to his fucking closet." Like,
Yes, yes. Which Will kind of plays it off as like, why would you go check in his closet? But again, like, we know so little about him. He probably we can't know that he didn't expect that she would go look in the closet and find that.
Right.
There's so many unknowns. But yeah, yeah. So um, there was certainly, like, I think some maybe foreshadowing, a little bit of kind of ominous tones about Judd, a little bit of uncertainty in the first episode, and that is played up uh, greatly here. Yeah, well, like you said, the discovery of a clan robe.
I think very, very importantly, not a Seventh K mask,
Yes, yes. Um,
which I think points to a couple of things, possibly that that I also think that there's a lot, and this is me, somebody not from the South, speaking about the South, so I'm throwing up a warning here of I don't know what I'm talking about, but I think that there's this sort of deeply held belief by people like me that there are people in the South who maybe don't agree with the specifics of their heritage, but are very quick to protect that heritage. Does that sound
sure.
fair?
Yeah. No, it does. Yeah.
And so I could see this being something that Judd had from a relative or from his youth, and while he might have reformed himself, in some way that this is just a remnant of his personal history or his family history.
Yeah, yeah, I think that that could be the case. You know, if you want to give like a charitable read to it, if you want, like, if you were to be less charitable, I almost wonder if like going back to kind of the you know, the distinction I had at the beginning of the episode about the Seventh K and their motives, you know, maybe this is highlighting a rift between the Seventh K and more kind of like traditional clan based
I mean, or
hate groups, you know.
yeah, if you want to take an even more maybe conspiratory path of this, maybe he's 7th K and that's why he survived the White Knight.
Maybe, yeah, but so that is kind of a case. It's like he could have seventh K ties, or I guess kind of like what I'm alluding to is maybe there's a difference in ideology here,
Right.
between the clan and the 7th K.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
We also met Bob Benson of Mad Men fame.
Oh yes, I sent you it's
Yes, you did. The
not great Bob.
Yeah.
Right when I saw it.
But he is Senator Kane, I believe his name is
Keen, I think.
Keen, and
Yeah.
he is. We see a headline that he's running for president.
Right. Which I think wasn't the Keene Act something in Watchmen?
That sounds very familiar.
Yeah, so the Keene Act, so the Keene Act was in Watchmen was a law passed in 77 that outlawed costume adventuring. Yeah. So but it seems like this was probably maybe his son,
or maybe even grandson.
Or grandson even, yeah.
Grandson even.
But yeah, likely related to the Keene of the Keene Act.
Yes. So yeah, I mean, there's just, again, this episode did fill in some blanks. I think, you know, the mystery, not mystery, that's the wrong word. Like, I did find it just noticeable that Angela's kids did not match her and Cal's race. That doesn't mean they couldn't have adopted. It was just, it was something that was obviously done deliberately. And so we have an answer to that. We know more about the White Knight now. We know more about Judd, although there's still a lot of unknown about Judd. We have a better idea of sort of Veight's world, but still there's no idea how those things happen. You know, it just we know a little bit more about Will, but we're given more Will questions too. So I think that this episode actually really does a nice job of filling in more of that world building that we praised for the first episode, while still giving us a fair amount of new mysteries to talk about.
Yeah, I would still say we have more questions than we have answers, but I think the answers that we have are good and important.
Yes. Any sort of closing thoughts on this episode?
No, other than I like the direction of the show so far. I think it is in a good place, and I think that it it's enjoyable in spite of and despite its ties to the original Watchmen.
Yes. I will say that the next episode, which is titled "She Was Killed by Space Junk," takes a pretty serious tonal shift. It doesn't throw away anything. It introduces kind of a different side of the world, and I cannot wait to talk about this episode with you, Zach.
Awesome.
Of all of the episodes, this is the one that I want to most talk about. So,
I know. You mentioned it to me pretty soon after you'd seen it, so I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. So all right. Anyway, thank you for listening to this, folks. I can't speak for Zach. I'm having a lot of fun talking about this show. I hope you are too, Zach.
Oh, I am. I definitely am.
Yeah, and it's going to get even more bonkers in the weeks to come. So thank you for checking it out. Go to multiversitycomics.com for all your comics needs. Follow us on Twitter at WilkerFox, at Brian Needs a Nap. And yeah, we'll be back next week with the review of, or rather a discussion of She Was Killed by Space Junk. And remember, who watches The Watchmen? Zach and Brian watch The Watchmen.
Fucking magnets, how do they work? Fucking magnets, how do they work? Fucking magnets, how do they work?